Hey, day 28 of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, coming to the tail end of our Defense in Depth section. Today we're talking about compromise detection. We talked about things like host based security, we talked about perimeter security. Now we're talking about how to go ahead and figure out if you've been compromised. Now, there's lots of signs of a compromise that you'll notice. You might see things like the obvious, your files are all encrypted and you've been hit by ransomware, right? A little pop up will come up that says, hey, we have all your stuff. Give us some Bitcoin, we'll get your stuff back. The less obvious ways are all going to come from a bunch of log sources on the network. So we talked about things like our firewalls being perimeter defenses. They're also some of the key places you're going to look for things like compromise, weird traffic patterns, access denied issues, things like that. We talked about host based defenses and we talked about things like file permissions. You're going to start seeing those pop up in your server event logs, your workstation event logs, things along those lines, your cloud and SaaS applications. And we talked about host based security, things like your AV, your EDR, your XDR, and even things like IPS and IDS solutions on your routers and switches. All of these areas are potential like tripwires or canaries for you. So you can see something going on that's maybe out of alignment or out of whack. And from there, you should be able to try to narrow down what's going on. Now, on its own, each of these are pretty difficult or are simple enough to kind of look at, but combined, it's a lot of work, right? If you have to imagine being on a network and going through and looking at every one of your firewalls, every server, every workstation, every router, and so on, I mean, that's pretty time consuming and realistically not possible, especially as you start getting into larger networks. So, what most organizations do is they migrate to something called a SIM, a security information and event monitoring solution. And what the SIM does is it takes all the logs from all those different devices and kind of brings them together for you. And the reason for that is a couple. I mean, there's several reasons, right? First off, data aggregation. It makes it so all those logs are in one place. Now you don't have to log into five different firewalls. You don't have to log into a bunch of routers, a bunch of servers, a bunch of workstations. It collects all that data and brings it together. Secondly, it does normalization. So data normalization is when you take similar data, but that's not very like, and make it standardized. So things like date formats, things like how IP addresses are presented, all that stuff, and it syncs it up. So if one of your devices is, capturing logs and using UTC minus zero as the time zone, and some of them are using your local time zone, it brings all that together and puts it into alignment. So when you're looking at the logs, it shows continuously and correctly and standard in a standardized format. A SIM will also do data correlation for you. So while you might look at a firewall and say, "Hey, that was weird. We got a whole bunch of blocked port connections over here," and then on a workstation there was actually an active port connection, the SIM can normalize or can correlate that stuff and say, "Hey, there was some weird stuff happening on this device, and that probably looks like a single event." And if it does look wonky, it'll also set off an alarm for you and say, "Hey, this is something you should probably go dive deeper into." And then obviously log retention is a very helpful one. While most of these devices can keep logs for a short duration, they're not infinite, and you're at the risk of an attacker wiping those logs unless you move them to a place that's more secure and kind of off the device. So a SIM handles that as well. So when we talk about detection, these are the kinds of tools you're going to use. You want a SIM generally that can collect all that log information if possible. You want to do these things like data aggregation and normalization. You need to be able to do correlation. And really, it comes down to where you're collecting information from. So be sure that if you start going down the route of implementing a SIM, you're thinking through where your log source is coming from and what data do they have access to. If you want to know what's trying to get into your network, obviously you need your firewalls. If you want to know what's going on servers, you need things like server event logs or syslogs. Workstations, you need workstation logs. If you want to know what your EDR is up to, you got to have the EDR logs. Get that all into a useful SIM, and you can suddenly start tracking detections really, really quickly. And that's day 28, everybody. Have a good day.